The autumn wind swept across the livestock auction yard, heavy with the sharp scent of hay and something colder disappointment. By now, most bidders had loaded their trailers with sleek cattle and polished horses, engines rumbling toward homes that promised profit. The pens stood half empty, except for one shadowed corner. There, forgotten, lingered a mare whose ribs carved dark lines against her dull coat. Once, she had been magnificent, but years of neglect clung to her like a shroud. Her head drooped, eyes dim but not lifeless eyes that still carried a story. The auctioneer barely spared her a glance. His voice was flat, weary, eager to finish. $25, he called, with all the enthusiasm of a man selling rusted scrap. Silence followed. A few buyers shifted, uninterested. He was about to move on when a quiet hand rose. Julia Gomez. A single mother in a threadbare jacket, boots scuffed from years of overwork and sacrifice. She cleaned offices by night, scraped through each month with barely enough for herself and her child. No one expected her to speak here, certainly not to bid on a broken-down mare with no future. The crowd turned. Some smirked, others shook their heads. But Julia didn't flinch. Something had passed between her and the mare in that instant, a flicker of recognition. Two lives discarded by a world that measured worth in profit and shine. Julia's voice was steady. "I'll take her." The auctioneer shrugged, muttered something about wasted money, but the gavel fell anyway. 5 minutes later, Julia pressed 25 wrinkled bills into his palm. It was everything she had, and not nearly enough for what waited ahead. Loading the mare was harder than buying her. The horse moved slow, deliberate, hooves dragging as though each step risked pain. Julia coaxed her gently, the same way she had guided her daughter through nights of fear and hunger. At last, the mare climbed into the cramped trailer. She didn't fight, just lowered her head with quiet surrender. Julia's hands trembled as she latched the door, not from the autumn chill, but from the weight of her decision. She had bought a responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear, with money she didn't have, yet her heart told her this moment mattered. The drive back wound through Calhoun's worn-down streets, past boarded windows and rusted for sale signs. This town, like Julia, knew what it meant to be abandoned. But just as the trailer rattled over the last stretch of broken asphalt, the mare shifted, stomping once, then again. Julia glanced into the rearview mirror and froze. The horse's head was lifted, ears pricked forward, eyes burning with something fierce. Not resignation, not despair, but defiance. And, in that raw defiance, Julia felt a jolt of fear and hope. For she realized this mare wasn't simply broken. She was waiting for her chance to fight back. What remained was a community of survivors, people like Julia, who worked multiple jobs and stretched every dollar, until it screamed, all while maintaining the stubborn hope that things might somehow improve. The hardware store that had been in the Peterson family for 4 generations now sold more lottery tickets than tools, and the diner, where high school sweethearts had shared first dates, now served coffee that grew weaker each month as the owner struggled to balance quality against cost. Even the elementary school where Rosa attended classes had been forced to eliminate art and music programs, leaving children with fewer outlets for creativity and fewer reasons to believe that beauty had a place in their practical world. Her property consisted of 10 acres of scrubland and a barn that leaked in 3 places, but it was hers, purchased with the life insurance, money from her husband's accident, and maintained through sheer determination and weekend labor. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, held upright more by habit than structural integrity, and the pasture grass grew in patches between areas of bare earth that turned to mud with every rain. But Julia had walked these boundaries every morning for 5 years, checking for breaks that might let their few chickens wander into the road, and she knew every square foot of land that represented her family's security and independence. Her 2-year-old daughter, Rosa, was waiting by the fence when they arrived, her school backpack still slung over her shoulder, and her expression mixing curiosity with the practiced skepticism of a child who had learned not to expect too much from life. Rosa had inherited her mother's dark eyes and her father's perfect, stubborn chin, along with a weariness that came from watching adults make decisions that didn't always work out as planned. The mayor stepped carefully down the trailer ramp, her hooves finding purchase on the packed earth, with the deliberate precision of someone testing unfamiliar ground. Every movement suggested pain, carefully managed, strength conserved for when it would be most needed. Julia noticed how the horse paused at the bottom of the ramp, nostrils flaring as she took in the sense of this new place, cataloging information that would help her understand whether safety was possible. Here, Rosa approached slowly, her hand, extended palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intention, and something magical happened in that moment of first contact. The mare, who had flinched away from every human touch at the auction yard, lowered her great head and breathed softly into the girl's palm, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to carry burdens too heavy for young shoulders. Rosa's face lit up with the first genuine smile Julia had seen from her daughter in months, expression that transformed her serious features and reminded Julia of the joyful child Rosa had been before life taught her to be careful with her trust. Julia had named her Espiranza, Spanish for hope, though the neighbors who stopped by in the following days suggested less optimistic alternatives. The mare was clearly past in her prime, probably closer to 20 than 15, and the veterinarian who examined her delivered a diagnosis that would have discouraged anyone with less stubborn optimism than Julia possessed. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and the kind of deep fatigue that came from years of overwork and undercare had left their mark on every aspect of Espiranza's being. Her hooves were cracked and overgrown, her teeth worn down by poor feed and neglect, and her coat carried the dullness that spoke of a system struggling to maintain basic functions. The vet, a kind man who had watched too many animals suffer from economic hardship, offered to put her down humanely and without charge, explaining that recovery at her age and condition was unlikely, and that keeping her alive might actually be prolonging her suffering. But Julia refused with the quiet firmness of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions, remembering how people had written off her own chances after her husband died and left her with a child to raise and the bills she couldn't pay. Instead, she began the slow process of rehabilitation, mixing grain with rice, bran to put weight on the mare's frame, and spending hours each evening brushing the tangles from her mane, while Rosa read aloud from her homework assignments. The routine became a meditation for all three of them, a daily reminder that healing was possible, even when progress seemed impossibly slow. Julia learned to read the subtle signs of Espiranza's comfort and discomfort, adjusting feed portions when the mare seemed overwhelmed by sudden abundance, providing shelter when weather threatened to stress her recovering system, and gradually building the kind of trust that allowed for medical care without restraint or sedation. The first signs that Espiranza was more than just another rescued animal came during the third week when Rosa was practicing for the school's annual fundraising fair. The girl had been selected to represent her class in the traditional folk dancing competition, but without money for proper lessons, she had been teaching herself from online videos, stumbling through the complex steps in their dusty yard, while Julia watched from the porch and offered gentle encouragement. Rosa's movements were earnest, but unpolished, her timing slightly off as she tried to match rhythms that seemed to slip away just as she thought she had captured them. The school's fundraising fair was one of the few community events that had survived the economic downturn, but it had grown smaller each year as families struggled with their own priorities and participation became a luxury many couldn't afford. Espiranza had been turned out to graze in the Mushin, small paddock adjacent to the practice area. But instead of ignoring the activity, as most horses would, she began moving in rhythm with Rosa's movements, her steps matching the cadence of the tan, music drifting from the girl's phone speaker. At first, Julia assumed it was coincidence, but as the days passed and Rosa's practice sessions continued, it became clear that the mare was actually dancing, her movements flowing with a grace that seemed impossible for an animal in her condition. The horse would lift her feet in time with the music, arch her neck in response to crescendos, and even pause during the quiet interludes, as if she understood the structure of the songs Rosa was learning. When Rosa noticed the synchronization and began deliberately including Espiranza in her practice, the mare's responses became even more pronounced, as if she had been waiting for acknowledgement of the partnership she had been trying to create. Word of the dancing horse spread through Calhoun, with the speed that only small-town news could achieve, drawing curious neighbors, who had initially dismissed Julia's purchase as folly. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store brought her grandchildren to see if the rumors were true and left, shaking her head in amazement at the sight of horse and girl, moving together with a harmony that seemed to transcend species barriers. The postal carrier began timing his route to coincide with Rosa's afternoon practice sessions, and even the fire chief, a practical man who rarely showed interest in anything that couldn't be measured in gallons per minute or the response times, found himself stopping by to watch the performances that had begun attracting small crowds of regular spectators. The local newspaper editor, desperate for positive content in a town that had grown accustomed to bad news, arrived with a photographer and left with a story that captured something the community hadn't felt in years. Here was proof that beauty and wonder could emerge from the most unlikely and circumstances. That value couldn't always be measured in profit margins or quarterly reports. The article, accompanied by photos of Rosa and Espiranza moving in perfect synchronization, was picked up by regional papers and eventually by social media accounts that specialized in uplifting content. The images showed Rosa in her simple school clothes, her face radiant with concentration and joy, while Espiranza moved beside her with renewed vitality, her coat beginning to show the luster that proper care was slowly restoring. Suddenly, people were driving hours to see the dancing horse of Calhoun, bringing their cameras and their children, and most importantly, their wallets. Julia watched the Pradanar transformation with a mixture of wonder and weariness, unsure whether the attention was blessing or burden. The steady stream of visitors meant income from the small admission fee she reluctantly charged, but it also meant pressure to perform that she worried might be harmful to both Rosa and Espiranza. The mayor seemed to enjoy the audience, her movements becoming more confident and elaborate as crowds gathered to watch. But Julia knew that public attention was fickle and that building their hopes too high might lead to devastating disappointment when the novelty wore off. She had seen too many people in their community pin their hopes on temporary solutions, only to face harder falls. When reality reasserted itself, the extra money was desperately needed, allowing her to reduce her night cleaning hours and spend more time at home. But it came with obligations that felt heavy, even as they brought relief. What she didn't anticipate was how the visitors begin exploring the rest of Calhoun, discovering the antique shops and local restaurants that had been struggling to survive, or how the positive publicity would attract the attention of people with both resources and vision. The coffee shop that had been considering closure found itself serving more customers in a week than they had seen in the previous 3 months, as visitors lingered to discuss what they had witnessed and make plans to return with friends and family. The antique store, which had been surviving primarily on online sales, suddenly had browsers examining furniture and collectibles with the kind of interest that translated into actual purchases. Even the gas station reported increased traffic as people made Calhoun a destination rather than simply a place to drive through on their way to somewhere more important. The transformation of Espiranza had sparked something larger than anyone could have predicted, a renewal of spirit that was beginning to touch every corner of their small community. Business owners who had been contemplating closure found themselves with customers again, and conversations that had focused on budget cuts and service reductions suddenly included discussions of expansion and improvement. The town council, which had been meeting primarily to manage decline, found itself grappling with the unfamiliar challenges of growth and development. The dancing horse had become a symbol of resilience and unexpected beauty, proof that even the most discarded and forgotten could find ways to contribute something meaningful to the world. But Julia knew that symbols were fragile things, and she spent sleepless nights worrying about what would happen if the attention faded, or if Espiranza's age finally caught up with her renewed vitality. The responsibility of carrying a town's hopes felt almost as heavy as, and the original decision to spend $25 she couldn't afford on a horse no one else wanted. Julia found herself fielding calls from journalists who wanted to understand the human interest angle of their story, from tourism boards that saw marketing potential in their unlikely success, and from well-meaning strangers who offered advice about everything from horse care to business management. Rosa was handling the attention better than Julia had expected, her natural shyness gradually giving way to a confidence that came from discovering she had something valuable to offer the world. But Julia worried about the pressure her daughter might be feeling to maintain performances that had begun as simple joy but were becoming increasingly important to their family's economic survival. As autumn deepened into winter, the crowds thinned, but didn't disappear entirely, replaced by a core group of regular visitors who came not just for the spectacle, but for the sense of community that had grown around Espiranza's story. These repeat visitors had become familiar faces, people who asked about Rosa's schoolwork and Espiranza's health with the concern of extended family members. Local artisans began selling handmade goods at the impromptu market that had sprung up around Julia's property, offering jewelry made from locally sourced materials, quilts that told stories of pioneer heritage, and pottery that reflected the practical beauty of rural life. The coffee shop that had been on the verge of closing reopened with extended hours to serve the steady stream of tourists, and its owner began featuring local musicians on weekend evenings, creating an atmosphere that drew both visitors and residents into shared experiences. Rosa's confidence had blossomed along with her dancing skills, and she now performed with the poise of someone who had discovered her own worth through the eyes of an audience that saw beauty where others had seen only poverty and limitation. The connection between girl and horse had evolved into something transcendent, a partnership that spoke to universal themes of trust, perseverance, and the power of believing in possibilities that others couldn't see. Their performances had developed subtle variations as Rosa learned to read Espiranza's moods and energy levels, adapting their routine to showcase the mayor's strengths while respecting her limitations. On days when arthritis made movement difficult for Espiranza, their dance became gentler, more contemplative, while on days when the mayor felt strong, their movements could be elaborate and joyous. Julia found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of town spokesperson, fielding calls from journalists and tourism boards who wanted to understand how a $25 horse had managed to accomplish what years of economic development initiatives had failed to achieve. The answer wasn't simple, because the truth rarely was, but it seemed to center on the idea that hope was contagious and that sometimes the most powerful changes came from the most unlikely sources. Espiranza hadn't saved Calhoun through any grand gesture or heroic action, but through the simple act of showing up every day and giving the best of what she has had to offer, inspiring others to do the same. The mayor's story had reminded people that worth wasn't determined by external circumstances, but by the willingness to keep moving forward, even when the path seemed impossible to navigate. The real test came in late December, when a severe ice storm knocked out power across the region and left many families struggling with heating bills they couldn't afford. Julia watched anxiously as the temperature dropped and wondered whether the visitors who had become so important to Calhoun's economy would brave the dangerous roads to see a horse dance in weather that made every step treacherous. The storm had damaged power lines throughout the county, leaving some areas without electricity for nearly a week, and the combination of cold temperatures and economic hardship created conditions that threatened to undo all the progress the community had made. Julia kept Espiranza in the barn during the worst of the weather, using body heat and extra bedding to maintain warmth, while Rosa worried that their audience might disappear just as suddenly as it had arrived. But on the first clear morning after the storm, cars began arriving as usual, their occupants bundled in winter coats and carrying thermoses of hot coffee to share with neighbors who had opened their doors to stranded travelers. The community had learned something valuable about resilience from watching Espiranza's recovery, and they applied those lessons when their own challenges arose. Residents who had generators shared power with those who didn't. Businesses that had remained open served as warming centers for families whose homes had become too cold, and the spirit of mutual aid that had always existed in rural communities became more visible and intentional. The visitors who came that morning weren't just tourists seeking entertainment, but people who recognized that they were part of something meaningful and wanted to contribute to its continuation. Rosa's performance that morning was particularly moving, perhaps because the harsh weather had stripped away everything except the essential connection between horse and rider. Espiranza moved with careful precision across the ice-dusted ground, her steps measured and sure, while Rosa matched her rhythm with the grace of someone who had learned to find beauty in difficult circumstances. The crowd was smaller than usual, but more engaged, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious that couldn't be manufactured or marketed, but only experienced in the moment it occurred. Their breath created small clouds in the cold air as they watched, and the silence between songs was filled with the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for sacred spaces. When the performance ended, and the mayor nuzzled Rosa's shoulder in their customary gesture of mutual appreciation, the applause carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. Julia realized that afternoon that Espiranza had given them something more valuable than tourism, revenue, or media attention, though both had proven helpful in practical terms. The mayor had shown them that transformation was possible at any stage of life. That being discarded by one group didn't mean being worthless to another, and that sometimes the most meaningful contributions came from those who had experienced their own struggles and emerged with compassion and tact. The lesson had rippled through Calhoun in ways both visible and subtle, changing how people viewed their own circumstances and their neighbors, the potential for growth and renewal. Children who had watched Rosa perform began approaching their own challenges with renewed confidence, while adults who had felt defeated by economic circumstances started exploring the possibilities they had previously dismissed as unrealistic. The spring brought new challenges and opportunities as word of Calhoun's renaissance reached urban planners and development companies who saw profit, the potential in the town's newfound popularity. Julia found herself navigating conversations about commercial partnerships and branded merchandise that felt far removed from the simple act of compassion that had started everything. Representatives from major corporations arrived with proposals for theme park development, franchise opportunities, and media deals that promised financial security, but threatened to transform their authentic story into manufactured entertainment. She worried about protecting Rosa and Espiranza from exploitation, while ensuring that the benefits of their story continued to flow to the community that had embraced them. The delicate balance between sharing their gift and preserving its authenticity required constant vigilance and frequent, difficult decisions about which opportunities aligned with their values, and which threatened to corrupt the very qualities that made their story worth telling. By summer, Calhoun had been featured in national magazines and tourism guides, drawing visitors from across the country who came seeking the authenticity that seemed increasingly rare in a commercialized world. The town had added a small visitor center staffed by volunteers who could share local history and direct tourists to businesses that had been revitalized by the increased traffic. Main Street had been repaved and new sidewalks installed, improvements funded by a combination of tourism revenue and grants that became available once the community could demonstrate economic viability. A permanent outdoor performance space had been created where Rosa and Espiranza could dance without crowding Julia's modest property, complete with seating for spectators and acoustic considerations that enhanced the musical accompaniment to their performances. The changes brought us prosperity, but also pressure as success, created expectations that hadn't existed when they were simply a struggling family trying to heal a broken horse. Julia watched carefully for signs that the attention might be overwhelming Rosa or causing stress for Espiranza, prepared to pull back if the cost became too high. Regardless of the economic consequences, she had learned to read the subtle signs of her daughter's fatigue and the mayor's discomfort, adjusting schedules and expectations to maintain the joy that had made their performances special in the first place. Rosa had grown more sophisticated in her dancing abilities, working with a volunteer instructor who had moved to Calhoun specifically to help preserve the authentic folk traditions that formed the foundation of their performances. But she had also learned to set boundaries around her time and energy. The real measure of their impact became clear during the annual town festival when Calhoun's population swelled from 800 residents to nearly 5,000 visitors over a single weekend. What could have been chaos instead became a celebration of community values that Espiranza's story had helped crystallize. Visitors were greeted not just as customers, but as guests, with local families opening their homes to provide lodging and sharing meals that showcased regional recipes and traditions. The festival programming emphasized local history, traditional crafts, and the kinds of authentic experiences that couldn't be replicated online or in urban settings. Demonstrations of blacksmithing, quilting, and woodworking drew crowds of people hungry for connection to skills that had built the community's foundation, while musical performances featured traditional songs that told stories of pioneers, farmers, and the enduring relationship between humans and the land they called home. Rosa and Espiranza's performances were the headline attraction, but they were surrounded by dozens of other demonstrations of skill and artistry from community members who had discovered new confidence in their own abilities and contributions. The festival had become a showcase for the kind of authentic rural culture that many visitors had never experienced, offering children from urban areas the chance to pet farm animals, learn traditional games, and participate in activities that connected them to agricultural heritage their own families might have left behind generations earlier. Julia watched couples planning their weddings after falling in love with Calhoun's romantic atmosphere, families discussing vacation home purchases after discovering the peace that came from slower rhythms of life, and entrepreneurs exploring opportunities to create businesses that would serve both residents and the steady stream of visitors who had made the town a regular destination. Julia stood at the edge of the performance, the ring that final evening, watching her daughter and their remarkable Mare move together in perfect harmony, while hundreds of people shared in the magic they had created. The mayor's coat now gleamed with health, her movements fluid and confident, but her eyes still held the gentle wisdom that came from understanding both suffering and redemption. Rosa had grown taller and more graceful, her skills refined by months of practice and performance, but she maintained the humble gratitude of someone who knew that her gifts were meant to be shared rather than hoarded. Together, they had proven that $25 spent with compassion could yield returns that couldn't be calculated in any conventional currency, creating ripple effects that had touched hundreds of lives and transformed an entire community's understanding of what was possible when people refused to give up on each other. The crowd began to thin as the evening grew late, but Julia noticed that many visitors lingered, reluctant to leave a place where they had experienced something authentic and meaningful. Children who had watched Rosa dance began attempting their own steps in the grass, while adults exchanged contact information and made plans to return with friends and family members who needed to witness this proof that hope could triumph over circumstance. The festival had been a success by every measure that mattered, generating income for local businesses, while preserving the values that made Calhoun worth saving. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that communities could thrive without sacrificing their character. Progress, Julia realized, didn't mean erasing the past. True growth came from honoring what made their town unique and daring to share it with the world. As the last headlights faded and the cleanup crews swept across the square, Julia stood still, letting herself feel the weight of how far they had come. 2 years ago, she had raised her hand at an auction, clutching 25 crumpled dollars, and taken home a horse the world had already condemned. No one believed Espiranza had anything left to give. Yet, the mayor had carried an entire town back to life, not through one miracle, but through the steady rhythm of survival, dignity, and quiet grace. Espiranza had taught them all that scars were not the end of the story, but the beginning of something stronger. She showed them that second chances didn't just heal individuals, they revived entire communities. Rosa learned that her worth was never tied to her family's poverty, but to the courage of sharing her voice. Julia discovered that leaping on hope, not calculation, could open doors she never imagined. And then, just as Julia turned to leave, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd that lingered by the barn. A local rancher, once the harshest critic of her decision, stood in silence as his prize stallion bowed his head toward Espiranza, as if recognizing a leader where none expected one. The moment froze everyone. The town, realizing that the horse they had dismissed as broken, had, in truth, become their symbol of resilience. Julia's breath caught. It wasn't just about saving a horse, or even saving a town. It was about rewriting the story of what people chose to believe was possible. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that hope often arrives in the most unexpected form, sometimes thin, scarred, and nearly forgotten, until compassion dares to call it back to life. Subscribe for more stories that prove ordinary hearts can spark extraordinary change, and that the smallest acts of courage can ripple outward, rewriting not just one future, but many.